Hello and good morning, everyone in Ljubljana. My name is Ulrike Schmid, and I'm a PhD student at the University of Innsbruck. Although I'm very concerned about the current situation in the world, I would like to thank you very much for the opportunity to speak here today. My talk, Squirrel, Lynx, and Field Mouse, How Textbooks Contribute to Speciesism, will give you an insight into my doctoral thesis. Or better, I will show you a short part of it. I will first introduce the framework conditions and then present a few extracts of my analysis with the help of some examples and then give you a preliminary conclusion. The subject of my research are Austrian textbooks about biology in lower secondary school, and the work concentrates on the aspect of the human-animal relationship, which is to be understood as a sub-area of the critical investigations in the educational sciences. As a critical textbook analysis, it deals with the reconstruction of the discursively conveyed knowledge about animals in Austrian textbooks. So I try to find out how the different animal species are conceptualized as biological animal species, as well as the cultural stories that are told about them. On the basis of different mammal species, it should be shown which forms of knowledge are passed on to young generations in textbooks, and moreover, it should be stressed that textbooks have gone through an approval process and the knowledge in it is to be seen as authorized and specialized knowledge. This is why Gerd Stein and Thomas Höhne define a textbook as a paedagogicum, informatorium, politicum, and constructorium, as the schoolbook knowledge has many different stakeholders to serve. Höhne called it, therefore, also a discourse arena, as there are social struggles taking place about what kind of knowledge should be represented in the books. The imparting of knowledge is a constitutive component in the context of social institutions like schools. Textbooks are instruments to place and to disseminate the knowledge desired by the society. There are a lot of specific expectations brought to school educations and the issues which should be taught. On the one hand, they are subject to the introductory demand to communicate basic knowledge about animals, for example, as well as more detailed knowledge in order to introduce certain subject areas. On the other hand, the knowledge content in textbooks is determined by social and political negotiations and is thus also subject to selection processes. Last but not least, the knowledge imparted is also pre-formed by the reference science of biology. However, it can or it must be assumed that the knowledge is presented in a largely value-neutral and factuality or professionally correct manner. The analysis takes up a social constructivist perspective and assumes that collective knowledge and thus social reality is constructed and constituted and structured through language. Methodically, parts of the discourse linguistic approach of Sylvia Wendel-Larcher, as well as the ecolinguistic linguistics of Aaron Stibbe are applied. Both approaches are orientated towards critical discourse analysis. As already said, the aim is the critical examination of the discursive knowledge reproduction in the approved textbooks. From an animal ethically perspective of human-animal studies, I investigated what is said about animals in the dimensions of historicity, selectiveness, and factuality. It is thus to be understood as a discourse analysis as critique. which contributes to the discussion about existing conventional patterns of thinking in dealing with other animals. My approach to analyze the textbooks was to divide the knowledge into scientific knowledge and cultural knowledge first. By scientific knowledge, I mean certain source concepts, such as the designation as a mammal, as well as certain characteristics, such as the occurrence, the nutrition, or the appearance. By cultural knowledge, I mean certain attributions to animals that do not primarily have anything to do with biology, but relate to the usefulness to humans. At the text level, I reconstructed the animal figures by seeking for attributes, characteristics, actions, motifs, or themes. The features of interest were, for example, the vocabulary, connotations of words, modal verbs, figures of speech, and so on. Beyond the text level, I looked for recurring modes of representation and appraisal patterns, for example. I found specific ways how animals are figured and conceptualized and thus positioned hierarchically. These strategies of conceptualization are my categories of analysis. I made up 3 main categories and 4 subcategories each. I've divided the main categories into affirmative, ambiguous, and distancing strategies, and then subdivided them again, of which I would now like to present a few to you. Of course, all these strategies of conceptualization can also be mixed together or intermingled. Example 1 is an easy or better, no surprising one. It's about personalizing, which mainly happens to so-called pets as dogs and cats. These animals get names and identities and are endowed with careers, for example. They are granted consciousness and feelings or sentience as well. The appraisal pattern that underpins the representation is the usefulness for humans. Another way to conceptualize animals is to ecologize or to aestheticize them. That means certain features or abilities are described as attractive, beautiful, shapely, or handsome, and so on. The squirrel, for example, is not only described as nimble and very cute, but also very useful for the dissemination of seeds in order to make the forest grow, from which man then can harvest the wood. So the message between the lines is again the usefulness for humans. Particularizing is another way of describing an animal. This means that specific characteristics such as behavior, traits, or some body features are displayed. With regard to domestic cattle, digestion seems to be the characteristic that defines the cow next to her attribute as a meat supplier. In this context, also the intestinal length and the digestive process is described in detail. Although this is certainly something that is special for this species, it's not all that makes a cow, but it's all that a textbook finds it worth to say about a cow. To euphemize is another way to show animals. Here, overarching relationships are concealed and certain or sometimes damaging effects are disguised or downplayed. With the mole, hedgehog, and bat, for example, they are described as beneficial animals as they extinct insects. Due to the fact that the insects also are killed through agricultural means, and this also has an influence on the lives of moles and bats. But this is called as the moles and the hedgehog disappear in the through the books. But also the insects killed are disappearing as an anonymous mass. Even the fox is often seen as an exterminator of mice plagues. And in this picture, you can see that the fox has babies while the mice are all shown at the same size. Although the books also are talking of about their offspring. This makes the fox more likable than the mouse, or it attaches a higher value to the fox than to the mouse. Also, this strategy is not a very surprising one, as it is about objectifying animals, mainly with pig and cow, who are commodified and radically reified as objects of food. One can often see pictures that divide the body parts of the animals into certain dishes, such as chops or milk and shoes and so on. This no longer has anything to do with a sentient being, nor does it show what it actually means for the cow or the pig to be divided into pieces. However, one can find objectifying also with the racialization of dogs, for example. So pupils are taught that races do really exist and that humans are creator of those races. The books show a great variety of different dog races and how they look like. And this means that animals or dogs can, or better should be, selected by their appearance. This is also accompanied by an occupancy of the animal bodies through humans. Furthermore, is to criticize that some of the images do not correspond to reality, as the mug here in this picture and the skeleton. And children therefore cannot infer that these dogs have severe problems with the breathing, for example, in reality. The last example I would like to show to you is about demonizing animals. This means that animals are described in a very negative or pejorative manner. Mice and also rats are undesirable co-inhabitants and pests that have to be killed. One textbook asks the children to bring mouse traps into the classroom and to discuss whether they would choose a killing or a non-killing trap. Mice and rats are often seen as something that threatens human order and are also disease carriers. So I come to the preliminary conclusion that the zoological knowledge is mixed up with cultural elements. The actuality of the knowledge conveyed in textbooks is partly outdated, partly orientated towards cultural values and utility concepts. It shows a very selective image of the animal and is vanishing the view of animals as individuals. Ethological insights are often completely missing. Normative anthropocentric appraisal patterns are the dominant mode of conceptualizing animals and the textbook mediated style of thinking. Animals are positioned hierarchically on a socio-cultural scale and are classified according to their usefulness for humans. This is the contribution of textbooks to the discrimination of certain animal species or the contribution to speciesism. Adolescents learn in biology textbooks to divide other animal species into useful and non-useful objects or resources. But the textbooks do not show that all animal species are subject of an own life. So This is the end of my brief insight, and I would like to thank you very much for your kind attention.